we first have to build that foundation of consciousness, tune in, learn how to be present to ourselves, our habits, our behaviors, our thoughts, and our feelings throughout our day. We create change when we notice, when we remove our attention, and when we give ourselves new choices actually in that moment.
Nicole, the title of your new workbook, How to Meet Yourself. I'm curious, just to put us all on the same page, broad stroke, what do you mean by that?
Really, really great question. The self that I'm referencing in the title and that the workbook takes us on a journey to meet is our authentic self, really peeling back the layers of our conditioning and all of the habits that really represent most of our daily lived experience to discover who we really are.
Cool. So who is this for? How many of us have gotten to that point without, having these strategies and tools in place?
I think the workbook actually, the idea for the workbook, I should say, came to me when I was writing my first book, How to Do the Work. And as much as I did hope that that was a very practical guide at the end of every chapter, really showed or offered journal prompts, different tools, steps to really embody the work of the chapter itself. But the whole time, Jesse, I was really aware that it wasn't as full, as comprehensive of a journey as possible. And I think the workbook really is for anyone who's on that journey of self-discovery, who maybe doesn't even know when I say the word authentic self, well, what do you mean? Who am I really? I think that speaks to many people like myself, waking up in my mid to late 20s, wondering who the heck I am. So in my opinion, the workbook, like I said, is my hope for, I should say, the workbook is a livable roadmap for anyone, wherever you might be on your journey of self-discovery, to really begin to reconnect with who you truly are.
Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty here and talk about authentic self. For somebody who this is a new term, I'm sure we all have a picture in our head what that might mean, but I'll have you get into the details there.
Yes. And for those of us who don't even have a picture of what we might mean, I want to first offer a bit of compassion and, speaking from that person that I was just sharing that I was, not even knowing what interested me, let alone these deeper questions. I think the first thing that comes to mind when we think of who we really are, we think of, what is my purpose, my passion? And again, speaking from the experience of, I didn't even know, Jesse, what my interests were, how to spend or how to choose to spend my daily time, my free time, my unstructured time. I didn't really know those more, I think, again, what some of us think are more surface level aspects of who we are. But in my opinion, it really embodies everything from what interests me, what comes natural to me, to those deeper questions of what is my purpose? What is my passion? What am I here to create? And I share those things again, speaking, knowing that I was one person who didn't resonate with even those concepts. I read about passion in books, purpose in books. And for me, those were just, ideas, concepts. And I didn't really understand that, as far as I see it, we all have that internal space within us. So the self that I'm speaking of is everything from what makes me unique to being me, what comes easy, natural, what I'm interested in, to those deeper questions. What is my journey here about?
And for somebody who might feel like, I have my life together, I feel like I know who I am, you talk about a period in your life, you quickly touched on it there, when you had this realization and went in and did the deeper work. You had your life together from the outside. You were a psychologist and, you're a professional, and talk about, I think that's important we get into that a little bit. The fact that somebody can appear from the outside to have everything together, but inside things can be running amok.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really describes, for me, which began as a point of confusion, because I did look around at the life that I was living, as I was nearing my 30s. And I had checked, to speak to your point, Jesse, all of the boxes in terms of, I had the successful practice. I was in a relationship. I was living in the city of my hometown in Philadelphia, where I chose to live. And I think from the outside, to speak to your point, I did seemingly have it all together, and I was, I had achieved by then all of the things that I thought I had wanted, or I thought that were, kind of coming from that deep, really purposeful place, only to realize that what was driving me for so long, as I believe it drives most of us, is an autopilot, that subconscious space of our mind that is created and formed and maintained by all the habits that we repeat beginning in our childhood. And so many of us are conditioned, for reasons outside of ourselves. So for me, just to translate this, I came to realize how much all of even that endless achievements that I had checked the boxes of throughout my life, how much of that was connected to this external need for validation. For me, growing up, not having the safe space in my childhood to even explore what were the things that just are interesting to me or I'm curious about, I really kind of set myself up to maintain the connections in my family through performance in and of itself. So waking up in my 20s, I came to see how all of these accumulated achievements that, were supposed to translate into me feeling happy and connected to this life, how all of that was really a function of that early environment, of my best ways I was able to keep those bonds, that safe connection to my mom in particular in early childhood. But again, none of that was really serving who I was. So that really big absent hole that I kept feeling, even though I was going right to the successful practice week after week, was really coming from the fact that I really wasn't tending to myself when I was showing up for all of the different reasons around me.
You talk about this hole you're feeling, and again, you had things together from the outside. I can imagine being somebody who does have things together from the outside, whether it be, you mentioned career, relationship, how it can be hard to switch because things, are good or mediocre or things are working, quote unquote, rather than having a crisis moment where, you have a serious addiction and your life is falling apart, your relationships are falling apart. So what I'm curious, Nicole, and I know this is just your story, but I think it would be helpful for people to understand when you decided to really flip things upside down and do this deeper work, what was the catalyst? Because, you could have just kept going the way things were.
Yeah. And I think to speak to your point, Jesse, as I was feeling the way that I was feeling, really disconnected, really exhausted, really unfulfilled in so many ways, I was hearing that very similar lived experience reflected back by most of the people around me, most of my friends. So many of us just exhausted, living for the weekend, not necessarily feeling connected to the life that we're living day in and day out. So to speak to your point, I didn't really question it. I thought, and I would, hear myself tell myself a million different things, everything from, well, this is what life must be like, right? We're adulting now. Nicole, you're entering your 30s. This is more or less what it's about. And hearing that similar experience reflected back, like I shared earlier, I was not sure I had any right to even question or to get curious of why I was feeling so deeply disconnected. Because again, I didn't have the quote unquote reason. I didn't hit the bottom that I saw and had worked with so many people having hit. I didn't have that big cataclysmic event. And so I felt a bit shameful, if I'm honest, with why am I? The main question I kept coming up against for myself was, Nicole, why are you so unfulfilled? Why do you feel so disconnected? In short, what is wrong with you? And really, again, unpacking that and exploring and understanding that nothing was wrong with me at all. So for me, the catalyst was a gradual accumulation, I think is the best way to describe it, of this deep rooted disconnection and lack of fulfillment that again came from a lifetime of living in a very disconnected way from myself. So while some of us, to speak to your point, do have those cataclysmic moments where we hit a bottom per se, and we can't imagine life continuing on. Others, I think much like myself, it's an accumulation over time. If we aren't serving ourselves and our needs, the number one thing that happens is we get incredibly resentful and we get really angry at the world around us. And for me, it was really shifting that focus and first beginning to explore what is the role I'm playing in this consistent feeling that, if I remember as far back as I can, had always been there for me, that feeling of disconnection that I'm describing.
And as you're going through this time of change, you're in a really unique position being a psychologist where I could see how that could make things easier because you've been through the education, you have a lot of tools and knowledge when it comes to the mind and navigating that area. But also, I could see how there could be some shame or embarrassment around the fact that somebody who is quote unquote helping other people is having her own challenges with the mind. So, talk about how navigating that part of it panned out for you.
Absolutely. And I'll go as far to say is that disempowerment that I was feeling not only reflected in my own life, I'm insightful. I have this self-awareness, or so I thought. I had all of the know betters, and yet I couldn't do better. I saw, Jesse, that same thing reflected in my clients. And, just speaking from my own lived experience, I would say that it was more frustrating and difficult for me to be in the room with these other humans who are, tasking me, paying me to, create a space for them to change, and, feeling as stuck in my own life, and then feeling a disempowerment in that clinical room where I did feel, no matter what amount of schooling that I had brought into the room, that idea of stuck kept coming up session after session. So for me, it was really seeing that stuckness reflected in my clients that was the most disempowering place, kind of almost feeling that pleading with people coming in the room week after week with reports of the same habits, the same behaviors, and like me, the same accumulation of feelings of discomfort, yet the inability to create change. So for me, it was really feeling disempowered as the professional in the room and trying to then seek understanding, right? If I do have all of these tools, if I was educated in the power of the mind, and right, why isn't the mind powerful enough was my main first question to overcome, like, why wasn't this insight that all of these clients were showing and, communicating week after week, why wasn't that enough? And what I came to find out was that the answer actually didn't lie in our mind at all. It lies in our body, in the dysregulation, in the nervous system dysregulation that so many of us, and the habits and patterns that we've adapted to cope with that dysregulation that so many of us are bringing from our childhood. So what began as a really low place in so many ways of feeling disempowered, feeling stuck personally and professionally, really began then a lifetime journey for me of expanding that practice to include the body, to really emphasize the nervous system in particular, which really does play an integral role in creating a shift from that stuck point.
Well, let's talk more about that. You talked about nervous system dysregulation, which, again, we probably all have an idea what that could be, but let's get into the nuances of what that is, and then we'll build up from there.
Absolutely. So just to really simplify what our nervous system is, our nervous system is our major, and I'm really going to simplify a lot of this. It's our major highway of communication, if you will, between the organ that is our brain and our body. It controls all of the functioning of all of our organs, and it controls or impacts most of the functioning of our mental life, our ability to think clearly, to plan for the future, to show up, to relate to other people, and pretty much everything in between. Our nervous system is wired. It has a main task outside, of course, of the huge task that I just described of keeping us, kind of functioning day to day. Its number one task is to keep us functioning day to day in terms of keeping us surviving. So outside of our awareness, every waking moment of every day, our nervous system is on alert. It's always scanning our environment for the next possible threat or possible, way that I could be caused bodily harm, emotional harm. And any time that I perceive the possibility of threat, again, I'm really simplifying the nervous system. The way we are wired is to deal with the threat. We become activated. Blood pumps to our muscles. Our heart rate begins to increase. Our breath might quicken. Our body is mobilizing its energy to deal with whatever the perceived threat is at hand. And the two main ways I deal with it, of course, I have the opportunity to fight it, to overcome it with sheer power. Or if I perceive that the threat is too powerful than myself, I might flee the scene, both keeping myself safe, hypothetically, when the threat does go away or I've overcome it or I'm safely, in the next room away from it, then my nervous system shifts back down. I'm calm, I'm present, I'm ready again for the next possible threat at hand. So that's really simple nervous system 101. For the large majority of us who didn't have, in childhood, our nervous systems are wired to connect with another human being. We are in a complete state of dependency. So that very beautiful dance that I just described of becoming dysregulated or stressed out and then going back into becoming peaceful, calm, or a lack of stress, safety, if you will, all of that happens assuming that we have another peaceful, calm, present nervous system in a caregiver around us. And then for the large majority of us who didn't have a present caregiver, no human was even available, or B, a caregiver who wasn't emotionally attuned, who didn't have safety in their own nervous system, what more often than not happens is instead of dealing with the threat and coming back into safety, we stay cycling in a state of nervous system activation. So many of us then enter into adulthood living with that constriction, that tension in our body, living with an escalated heart rate or quickened breath all of the time. And if you were to even just drop into your body right now and tune into, how do your muscles feel? How is your breath? Is it coming from your chest? Is it coming from your belly? What about your heart rate? Those are really good pillars to check in with to determine if your heart rate is quick, if you're breathing really shallow from your chest, if you feel your muscles are clenching, or you feel the blood, coursing through your veins, chances are your body might be indicating that it's perceiving a threat somewhere in your environment.
So to make sure I understand this correctly, it comes back to the parenting and the attachment we have to our parents as kids, and that feeling of being able to connect emotionally with them. And when that goes awry, as we get older, our nervous system is on high alert, it's getting triggered. And for some people, that's just basically an ongoing state of high alert.
Yes, the way our nervous system learns how to even regulate itself is through a relationship with someone else. So if we didn't have, and again, I'll just speak from my own lived experience, knowing that both of my parents, by the time I was born, my mom was 42, my dad was 45, they themselves were stuck in a state of nervous system dysregulation and survival mode and fight or flight mode. So their inability to be safe for me led me to feeling overwhelmed with my feelings. The way that we regulate our nervous system and learn how to then regulate our feelings, how we even make sense of what our emotions are, let alone how and what to do to allow us to feel better. All of that is developed or created and maintained in that early relationship. So for me, in having a daily, even a stressful daily experience of development without that safe caregiver in the presence of my mom, all of those feelings in my body just translating into a real live lived experience were completely overwhelming for my system, for my body, that is. Without her safety to bring my body back down to calm, I did the best thing that I could do. I began to check out and spend less and less time in that body tending to my emotions. So talk about shame, flash forward now in time, like we were talking a bit about earlier, let's revisit me being that clinician in the room. Now, not only am I feeling disempowered because all of these tools, right, aren't working. When it really comes down to it, when I really started being honest, I was a human who had very little emotional resilience myself. I was a doctor, right, supposedly of emotions, of psychology, tending or helping others tend to or navigate their emotions. And I spent such little time in my body that I had no emotional resilience, meaning I didn't have the ability to understand, let alone tend to my emotions. So not only do we become stuck in cycles of dysregulation, we become reliant on that early way that we learned how to create safety. So for me, that was that checking out behavior. So of course, it's really understandable now, bringing this conversation full circle. I was overwhelmed in childhood. Emotions were too much for my body. So I checked out to keep myself safe. And then over time, I kept checking out. I kept relying on that disconnection mechanism to keep myself safe. So then flash forward, I enter my 30s. I'm living in a completely dysregulated body with no ability, no emotional awareness, and little to no ability to tend to my own emotions outside, of course, of that old habit of checking out. That's, of course, then what led me to be, right, disconnected from my life, disconnected from the world and all of those achievements I created, because again, I was living in generally that state of disconnection.
Well, let's talk more about the details of what that felt like when you were in that state of disconnection. Because for people that are tuning in now and might feel like, okay, that kind of sounds like me, what was that like?
I really appreciate this question, Jesse, because for me, it was normal. It was really even hard for me I would never have used language like, oh, I'm disconnected and this is what it feels like. Because I think speaking to all of those people who are living this experience, this is our normal. It's the only thing we're used to feeling. And for me, that meant feeling very little. Like I just shared earlier, I had very little emotional resilience. My emotional repertoire, if you will, or my contact with emotions really were two emotions: stressed and overwhelmed. Those were really the emotional literacy that I had, because those are the emotions that I spent the most time in. I spent the most time in a stressed out body, and I had very little experience with other feelings like sadness, like anger. I was, again, in this state of disconnection. So reconnecting with my body, and all of us reconnecting with our body, means reconnecting with our emotions. So the first thing you might notice or experience is having limited emotional experiences, really finding yourself stuck. Maybe for me, it was stress. Maybe for some of you listening, it's, oh, I only feel anger. Or maybe it's, I feel numb. I feel little to nothing most of the time. I think that's a very real way that this state of the state of disconnection is described. And again, for me, it just felt like I just was very flat most of the time. If I wasn't feeling stressed, let me say it like that, I was feeling pretty flat most of the time. And again, I think a lot of people will describe that numbness. I was described by others in my early 20s as aloof. And again, in those moments, it was really confusing for me to hear these sort of descriptions of myself, because I didn't feel to be necessarily fully, disconnected and aloof in my relationships, yet that is how other people were experiencing me. So I think, to speak to your point, or to really simply answer your question, when we are disconnected, it's difficult. We only know ourselves the way we know ourselves. We might feel a flatness, a lack of emotions, or we might hear from other people that flatness or that aloofness or that surface levelness reflected back.
Coming to your story, it goes back to childhood and not having that connection with your parents. Then you had the nervous system dysregulation. And then your particular coping mechanism was this, you were under stress and you had this flatness to basically your emotional state.
Yeah, so being overwhelmed in childhood, not having the ability to kind of come back into safety, to be able to then have more emotional experiences, to learn even what emotions are. I mean, some of us might be even listening, being like, learn emotions. What do you mean? Isn't that just part of our human experience? And absolutely, emotions are part of our human experience, though our understanding of them, how to even acknowledge when we're having or witness when our body is having an emotional experience, let alone what we do with them next, is very much a learned experience. So for me, from that overwhelmed state in childhood, as we will all do, I adapted. So my nervous system went very quickly from that fight or flight state into that complete shutdown, because in childhood, I was dependent. I couldn't just pack up my bags and leave. I needed these caregivers in the home in which I was living to literally care for my physical existence. So that was an example of one of those ongoing stressors that can't be avoided in childhood. So my nervous system went very quickly from the fight or flight option into, I can't leave, so I'm going to just shut down. And then that kind of achievement-based, externally driven, validation-seeking person, automaton in a way, was that habit self, that autopilot, that way that I was able to maintain that connection. Because in childhood, the way I did get celebrated, seen, acknowledged, my version of love in childhood came when I was doing just that, when I was performing, when I was either achieving academically, achieving athletically, or not causing added stress to the already overstressed home. So when I was showing up in service, in people-pleasing service of my family, keeping the peace, if you will. So what I woke up to then in my late 20s was that habit self and the reality, again, that life I created around me that should have translated to deep connection, to deep feelings of fulfillment and purpose, right? I checked all of these boxes. Yet I came to understand that all of that, even that self that I was being, that very achievement-driven self, was an adaptation. That was my best attempt to feel loved, to feel successful, to feel worthy of connection, of my relationships, and of my life. But again, all of that was grounded and developed in that early environment as my only way to keep me safe. So now, of course, me showing up and what I do personally and professionally, is part of my story, though it isn't all of my story. So peeling back that layer and discovering my authentic self meant discovering aspects of me outside of this performance-driven person. What are other things that interest me, even in absence of getting that external validation, and creating space for the lived action in those areas of my life?
So again, making sure I understand this correctly, you had this flatness feeling inside, but your outward projection to compensate for that and to try and find love was to have this achievement. You were very driven and you were seeking achievement, hence your PhD and becoming a psychologist.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of us, we begin to embody, these general, and we call them our personality, right? This is just who I am. I'm achievement driven. I'm a perfectionist. And we wear these identities that, in my opinion, were created more often than not from early environments, from needs that maybe weren't as consistently met as could have been. And then it becomes who we are. It's this cape then, right, that we wear around ourselves. But when we really pull back and understand that it was coming from that conditioned place as a best attempt to get connection, to get love, then we can understand that hole that I was describing earlier, why that hole was still there and was not getting filled in by these accomplishments, because that isn't actually what can allow me to feel wholly loved. That all of those behaviors were only validating that one part of me. It was keeping me stuck, and this is what many of us do, in that cycle of our childhood relationships where I'm only seeking to be validated, to be loved, to be connected to in the ways that were once familiar, which is why so many of us even feel at conflict or even at odds within ourselves, because that hole never goes away. That desire to be loved just for me being me has always been there. And what's actually happened, the byproduct of that overachieving self, has been exhaustion, has been overstepping my own limits, has actually been not serving my authentic whole self. Because in the moments where what I needed was in contradiction with what I imagined the world needed of me or this person needed of me, I more consistently than not over time squashed what I needed in service of what I imagined someone else did. So my journey really was allowing more parts of me to just be, and to be lovable, and to be okay.
So I think we've went pretty deep into your story and how things manifested. I'm curious now for other people that you've worked with over the years, what are some different ways that it manifests within the person? You mentioned the flatness you felt. And then there's the second layer to this as well, where your outward projection was that achievement. So what other ways might people be compensating for those unmet needs as a kid?
Yeah, absolutely. I really even love the way you're asking this question. I do believe that most of us are living in compensation, in patterns of compensation and habits that were grounded in compensation, well into our adulthood. So another really common example, I'm kind of sharing I'm shut down, right? My nervous system couldn't fight, couldn't flee. It got to that point of overwhelmed way too consistently, and it started to play dead. More often than not, another really common version of what happens is when we're stuck in that fight or flight. So when we aren't yet fully as completely shut down as I had become, when we're actually always on edge, we're hyper vigilant, we're scanning our environment, we're always waiting and looking and tending to things outside of us, waiting for that next shoe to drop. And a lot of times that manifests in and of itself in our relationship patterns. We can become very hyper vigilant to partners, very controlling of the environment around us, always micromanaging, really difficult to tolerate space between, when we have a partner who maybe needs some time or space for something. When we're always on edge, when we're hyper vigilant, a lot of us take indications of space to mean indications of being left or being abandoned. So when we are locked in sympathetic overdrive or when we're hyper vigilant, we begin to see anything and everything as a possible threat. And of course, then the individual manifestations of that, the way we adapt in our relationships can look like a million different things. Like I said, any version of control, any version of just always being on edge, always being jumpy. And then everything we do to manage that in and of itself. We can become combative in our relationships. We can become distracted. We can distract ourselves mentally. We can avoid difficult conversations. Again, all of these are ways to navigate navigate something that feels too much, uncomfortable, possibly threatening.
And how many people do you feel like are being affected by this?
I think more of us than aren't are, I think very few of us, let me word it this way, were raised by securely attached, or were raised in secure attachment. And what that means is having a caregiver who not only was safe in their own bodies and able to model, nervous system regulation, was able to reconnect with us after moments of disconnection or after moments of conflict. So having a human who's able to consistently be present to their own emotions so that they can then be present to our own emotions is really a tall order, especially, in past generations, where for many decades, even parenting advice in and of itself completely left out our emotional worlds. And there was even a brand of parenting, the cry it out method, where, when children are dysregulated, there was a brand of thought that the best thing you could do for them is actually to lock them alone in a room when they're in that state of dysregulation to tend to themselves. So obviously, in terms of nervous system health and wellness and regulation, I can make an argument that that little human who's dysregulated in that moment needs another point of contact, though they need a safe point of contact. And again, from parenting advice to differing resources that many of our past generations either had or didn't have access to, really impacts our individual ability to tend to our emotions, to be safe in our own emotional expression. And the reason why I'm intentionally saying it that way, that means then that very few of us, in my opinion, have been raised by that secure figure. So more of us than aren't are in that category of we have some remnant of an adaptation of a way that we once had to keep ourselves safe when we didn't actually have that consistent grounded secure base in childhood. So the simple answer is a lot of us came from that dysregulation. Very few of us, in my opinion, were raised by securely emotionally attached adults.
And coming back to your story, we've got into a lot of the details psychologically or internally what that was like. But did you have any physical manifestations when you're going through that time and when you got to that point when your nervous system was fried and things were going awry?
Yeah, I mean, let's even go back in time to talk about physical manifestations that I thought were just part of me, part of my genetics, seeing similar patterns in my family. Jesse, as long as I can remember in terms of digestive issues, I mean, severe constipation to the point where I would tell some people how long it had been since I had a bowel movement, and it would be shock. In terms of days, weeks, even at times, where such severe constipation, again, hearing similar in my parents, in my family, I thought, okay, I just have digestive problems, and that's just, part of my story. Memory. I learned probably in my teenage years when I would start to hear friends talking about, their early childhoods and sharing stories of, early holidays or Christmases and how they were spent. And I noticed a large absence of that kind of movie screen memory, as I call them, the ability to even remember early scenes from my childhood or to recall them. I didn't have those. Physically, sleep was always something that I would lay in bed at night with racing thoughts, racing worry-based thoughts about possible bad things that could happen. And, my sleep was off. So I was always exhausted, wired and tired, waking up in the morning, feeling like I hadn't slept, barely able to get through the day. And I lived with those symptoms until I, entered into my 30s. And actually at one point right before I began to explore what was really going on and had the language of my nervous system to even, factor in, I was actually really frightened because I started to, in addition to not having memory, always feeling like I had a bit of a film or brain fog over my brain. Again, heard a lot of similar in people that I would talk to, so just thought it was aging and all that comes with it. And I then started out of nowhere to faint. I had 2 moments of fainting that really were scary. Once I was with a childhood friend, and once I was shopping with my partner, Lolly, and I was in a store and just fainted in public and had never fainted before and was really scared. And at that point took to the good old world of Google to try, and at that I thought I was going to diagnose myself with something wrong in my brain at this point because I didn't have memory issues. Now I'm having a hard time, thinking clearly, even more so, having a hard time finding my words, and now I'm fainting. And of course, the gift of that really kind of scary moment or 2 moments in time was going online and really beginning to understand the nervous system and really mapping all of this now back to that deep-rooted dysregulation, the fact that I was living in a traumatized body, which explained then why I wasn't sleeping. I was spending little to no time in my rest and digest nervous system, why I had such severe constipation. My body never felt safe enough to fully digest my food. And all of my symptoms began to make sense, including losing consciousness. It was almost the final stop in this nervous system shutdown where literally my consciousness didn't, irony not lost on me that the first time it happened, I was around a childhood friend, lost my consciousness. So having the language really relieved a lot of fear and concern and helped me then understand and apply everything that I was just sharing in terms of the role that my nervous system was playing into my clients. And I began to understand and have language for where this stuck even comes from to, again, the somatic work that we need to then do or can begin to do to create this much needed regulation in our bodies.
Well, let's get into the work. Up until this point, we haven't really got into the practical of what to do. And like you just stated, as this has been going on for a period of time, you might start picking up different symptoms, physical, mental, your nervous system is dysregulated, you have all kinds of stress. It could seem really overwhelming for somebody who's going to take on a healing journey from that point. So, again, coming back to you and your experience working with people, how do you recommend somebody get started when they have all these different symptoms, whether they be physical or mental?
Yes, I think the first statement that I want to make to anyone on any version of a journey of change is I want to kind of acknowledge how little we like change as humans. Even the most logical change, even the habits that we know are going to get us closer to health or wellness or this goal that we want to set for ourselves. According to that subconscious part of our mind, much like our nervous system that is wired to solely keep us alive, it doesn't like the unfamiliar, because in that unfamiliar is the possibility of that threat that we talked about a bit earlier. So into our neurology in a lot of ways is wired, really, I like to simplify it in terms of we're wired for the familiar. Even if, again, many of us have had decades of, the fallout, the consequences of those familiar habits and patterns, many of which I would talk about week after week with my clients, right? All of these things we want to avoid happening again. According to our subconscious, in those moments where we're going to make it or break it and we're going to make the decision to do something new, we will feel uncomfortable in doing it. So the first statement I want to make to anyone who's going to change is that it's not going to be comfortable. You're going to meet what I call resistance, whether or not it's the endless litany of thoughts, all of the reasons why we convince ourselves out of even doing the new thing to begin with, or we hyper focus on how it's not working quick enough and we might as well just go back to those old habits because this isn't meant for us. Or maybe we just feel so uncomfortable in our skin. Maybe it's a body that we're now learning how to reconnect with. You just heard me talk about the major part of my journey was reconnecting with my body. The second I began to turn my full attention to my body, what was in my body, all of that discomfort didn't go anywhere. All of that dysregulation and overwhelming feelings that I had been accumulating for decades of time was all still there. So really short and simply, we don't want to change. There's going to be uncomfortable resistance that comes when we begin to move in a new direction. So the best way we can set ourselves up to work with that is to acknowledge that it will be present and part of our journey. It is not an indication that we're going in the wrong direction or that this isn't meant for us or that this is too hard or too uncomfortable. There's value in teaching ourselves how to experience a bit of discomfort and how to do it safely. So with change comes discomfort, and the way we can work with it is not by setting up ourselves with 5 new things that we want to begin to do starting tomorrow. And again, I think it's really natural, especially for those of us who maybe have hit that bottom. Maybe life, like we were talking about earlier, has come crumbling down around me and I need things to be different starting tomorrow. It's really natural then to say, okay, well, let me restyle my life from top to bottom with 10 new things I'm going to do starting tomorrow. 1 new thing is going to be difficult. So set yourself up to succeed by not piling on 4, 5, 6, set one, as I call it, small daily promise, and practice keeping it as uncomfortable as it'll be, as those thoughts will come, as you might be reconnecting with your body and all of the discomfort that has been living in there for decades. Learning how to tolerate the discomfort of change, I think, is the best suggestion for any of us to get us started in working with the discomfort of change.
And I think the paradox too of this whole situation of getting started is the fact you mentioned somebody maybe wanting to pile on a whole bunch of change at once, 5 or 6 things, which is understandable because again, coming from a place of somebody's feeling terrible and their days are really challenging right now, you can get why they would feel like that. But also, if they're going through a period right now where things are very hard, you can understand how they also might be afraid from the other way of putting any change to the situation because they're already so stressed out and pushing through to get through the day. So I can see how, both ends of that spectrum, it can be a really challenging. I'm feeling for people is what I'm getting
Yes.
at.
Yes. And let's feel for people a bit more, Jesse, and complicate things a bit further and wrap my story into it. A lot of our habitual coping is connected to roles we play in our relationship, right? Me performing, showing up in achievement, serving others before myself meant that as I began to change, to factor myself in a bit, to create a bit of space, to even just drop in and check in with what I wanted, needed, desired in any given moment before I just, overstepped me in service of someone else. That then meant if over time in that space, I did come to discover that I want something in opposition to what someone else might want or need of me. And as I began to empower myself to make those choices, then that means that other people are impacted, especially as we begin to change, and especially for the many of us whose adaptations do involve roles we're playing, right? We've become the caretaker because for many of us, that was the only way that we were able to keep ourselves safe in childhood, was by showing up, either maybe caring for a parent in a very parentified role, maybe caring for ourselves because our parents weren't present to us. And now, lo and behold, we become a caretaker to other people, and that becomes who we are. Now, if of course we want to create space, and we've determined, like me, that there's some moments where I need to care for myself before I can pour into someone else's cup. Now we have dominoes that will affect everyone else that has come to expect me showing up in care of them, much like as I began to change how I showed up and in honoring myself and my needs, that then meant that I changed how I showed up in relationship to other people. So everyone who had come to, expect, because over time I had showed up in service of them. And now, lo and behold, I'm going to pick me in this moment. There's going to be at minimum a violation of expectation. That person's going to be surprised. Oh my gosh, Nicole, you're not available to me in this one way that you've always been. And then of course we can complicate matters further by acknowledging that not everyone will just stop at being just slightly surprised, right? We now might touch something deeper in them. They might have a reaction to our new way of being. So feeling for people, and the entirety of this journey, because it does impact people outside of us. And we can flip the switch and view this through a much more empowered lens, which is that as difficult as it might be for all of those around us to, see these to set new expectations, I should say, for us and for our relationship, right? Over time, we're going to show up as so much more of a whole, connected person, and we're going to be much less likely to be resentful of them, right? When we continue not to get our needs met, because we will have changed. We will have begun to acknowledge ourselves and what we need to do differently in service of our relationship. So then that resentment, that anger that often does leak out when we're not getting our needs met won't happen anymore. So as difficult as I think as it is in the short term for people to tolerate our change, for us to begin to pour into our own cup, over time, I really do think it benefits the entirety of the relationship, that person who might be surprised and upset included.
Wow, that's such a good point. It's not just us, there's this other layer of the people in our lives. And Nicole, I know part of your story in this, I'm curious if it ties back to when you were going through the early part of your healing journey, was you actually had to set up boundaries where you cut off communication from family. So as you're telling this part about how it ripples out and affects the people around you, it gets me thinking about that. And is that what happened there?
Absolutely. So I'd come to discover that, right? This idea, me showing up in service of, was the strongest in my family. Like I shared, learning at a very early age how to maintain those connections for me meant not really showing my true self, not bringing my issues, my concerns into my family unit, and always showing up again in service of the latest stress, whatever was needed in the moment in time for my family. Very much entrenched. Again, some of it I believe is cultural, coming from an Italian heritage. My dad is, very, committed to his Italian heritage. And I would hear growing up in many different ways, statements around how family is everything, right? That is all we have in life, is this idea of family. And so for me, as I began to peel back, and of course, none of this happened overnight, I began to reconnect with myself, peel back my layers, really truly explore, witness how I was showing up. And I continued to see myself pushing down what I want and what I needed in relationships with my family in particular. So over time, I had tried, before I got to the kind of point of needing to cut off, or the decision I had made for myself, the needing to cut off communication entirely, I tried different versions of creating boundaries, of having separation, at being a little less available, at family, everything from family dinner event to the latest family crisis. I tried to give myself space while still remaining connected to those relationships. And much like I was just describing, those reactions of others, the space in my family was really limited. There was a lot of reaction, a lot of focus on the impact of my lack of presence, that I was starting to now choose to be a little less present to them, a little less available to them, so that I could care for myself, not from not from a hurtful place. I wasn't necessarily trying to hurt or punish them in any way. I was just acknowledging that I had some needs that I wasn't getting met. And as I tried to, uphold my own boundaries, it was really difficult, because those patterns are really deep rooted. I was living in the same city. I was very accessible to them. So after a lot of soul searching, and, I did make probably one of the most difficult decisions I made to date, which was to ask, for space, to tell them that I needed, I should say. It was less of an ask and more of a statement that I was taking some distance from them. And I explained to them, more or less what I was, what had been coming up for me, why I felt that I needed that, and that I had hoped that they would give me that space to do that. And quite honestly, Jesse, I had no idea of how they would receive my request, of how it would be for them, and honestly, of how long I would need. I just knew in that moment that I needed to prioritize myself. And even that action of making that request, of course, it was filled with guilt, with upset, with concern, with worry, with everything from, oh my gosh, are they going to completely, abandon me if I did decide, or when I do decide I want to work on the relationship, because that was ultimately my goal. I didn't want to have to not be in relationship with my family. I just didn't necessarily see any other option for creating the space that I needed. So I hit that very hard stop. I asked for that space, and I took what I needed, not knowing how and if or when they would be on the other end of it. And it was probably about 18 months where I'd started to, in that time, feel more and more confident in myself, feel more and more confident in my ability to maintain those boundaries, knowing that it wasn't my family's responsibility. If I wanted to change my relationship with them, that meant that I had to hold myself accountable first. I had to, take the space I needed, not feel bad, and keep myself grounded on my journey. And by around 18 months of having that more full space, of course I thought about them. Of course I worried about them. Of course I wondered what they were doing and how it would be, if and when I reached back out. I did then make that choice to reach back out, very open-ended, just, more or less letting them know what I had been doing in that time and seeing where they were. And I was very, very relieved that they were not only they had used that time apart to not only start their own family therapy, many of them entered in their own individual therapy, that they understood. While of course we did meet in many family sessions and unpacked and had many different difficult conversations, more fully exploring my decision, the patterns and the habits that I was becoming very clear had been very present in my family that I was committed to changing, where then we were able to talk about it as a whole family unit. And as far as I see it now, it's several years into our reconnection where my relationships with all of my family is a general, kind of group unit, and my relationships with them as individual members of the family look very, very different. Even the fact that I'm able to acknowledge that I have a different relationship with the unit and with individual members of that unit is huge, because one of the emblematic features of my family is how we potted ourselves together as this group dynamic. And we had these ideas about what makes us LePeras and things that aren't us LePeras. And there was very little space for individuality. We had very much this group think mindset that I went along with for a very, very long time, even though there was a lot that made me unique, that makes us all unique, that makes me different than my family. It felt very unsafe for me to have separate relationships with them. Everything from group think to group dynamics got grouped in together. So being able to explore individual relationships with my individual family members for me is such a testament that I don't believe would have been possible without that space for all of us.
That's where I was going to go next. I was going to say, looking back in hindsight, it's always 2020. Could you have done things differently? And I'm happy to hear in the end things worked out, for the better. But could things have been done differently with where you're at now and your perspective now to approach that situation from a different way?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I don't think, because it's like a corner we're backed into. The thing I needed most, right, was space, was boundaries. And the thing I struggled most with, that conditioned pattern in my family, was around space and around boundaries. So without kind of hitting that hard stop and not giving myself those moments to, in real time have to acknowledge what I need, what do they need, what choice am I going to make? For me, giving myself the gift of that space where I wasn't even necessarily needing to factor in them was what I objectively needed. I don't know if I would have been able to create, I guess, that, that bubble of space while I was still fielding phone calls or, hearing about the latest thing that was happening. I do think for me, I needed that hard stop, if you will, that objective distance, where I held myself then accountable to that. Because part of this meant then that I wasn't also reaching out, going back on my request. And there was many moments where it was difficult as the first round of holidays, right, came. It was really painful, not only for me to be alone and not connected to my family on the holidays, but to wonder how they were doing, not in connection with me. And so for me, there was so much work, I think is what I'm trying to say, and just managing how I felt in that separation, that I needed that separation to be able to focus and give the priority to me. I had tried, versions of creating space in active relationship with them. And of course, everyone's journey is going to look different. I think for my family, for me, for my family dynamics, us all having that space was really necessary.
I want to come back to the practical now. And we started out getting into this saying we don't want to take on too much in the beginning. Pick one thing and make it a small thing to get, the inertia going in the beginning. And also the fact that it isn't going to be easy. This work is hard. We touched on that as well. But when it comes to that one thing that we're going to approach and take on in the beginning, how do we decipher from all the different areas? If life is awry, how do we pick where to begin?
You're always going to hear some version of the same answer whenever I talk about beginnings of a journey. I wrote about, the beginnings of it and how to do the work. And I very intentionally separated this new workbook out into three separate sections. Body, followed by mind, followed by our authentic self, or, the deeper parts of us. And before we even get to the foundation of the body, the prequel, if you will, part of the workbook talks about a practice of consciousness, of becoming conscious to ourselves, whether or not it's all of the habits that are coloring our day or these points of new choices that we're talking about. Because that's how change happens when we show up. And instead of doing that old thing, we do something new, despite how uncomfortable it is, right? We make a new choice. Choice can only happen when we're consciously present to what's happening now, when we're not locked and loaded on that in that autopilot, already saying and doing the thing and kind of tuning in later after the fact. We need to be consciously present to now to even be able to make that new choice. This is what the difference between all of those clients that I was sharing about earlier, right? In those rooms, we are in the conscious state of our brain. Literally, we're planning this new action for this future time that's going to look very similar, but I'm not going to do that same old thing. I'm going to remember that thing doesn't work and I want this new future outcome. All of this is happening from a very powerful part of our mind, of our brain, called our consciousness, the prefrontal cortex, where we have all of that ability to be in observance of the old habits and patterns that don't serve us, to see the outcomes and how much they don't serve us, and to think and create and plan for a future that's different. Yet lo and behold, those moments in time where I need to show up and make that new choice, when I see almost that crossroads, what was happening time and time again for myself and my clients was I wasn't in that part of my mind at all. I was locked and loaded. My emotional brain was fired up and I was in my autopilot, living that habitual reaction that was once kept me safe. And then I come in to my therapist's office next week and I feel very shameful, thinking something's wrong with me, not understanding that all of this was just programmed into my subconscious. I didn't actually give myself a chance to make a new choice because I wasn't conscious in that moment. So the number one small daily promise, daily commitment any of us can make to ourselves, whether or not we want to change or not, just to live a more connected life, would be to create a new daily habit of being conscious, of how to be in observance, of how to even see one of the major premises, if you will, that the workbook is built on, right? All those layers we've been talking about peeling back, are all of those habits. Right? You're going to meet in this workbook all of the habits that have created the life around you. To be able to even observe your habits, we need to be present. We need to show up tomorrow morning, say, instead of just the moment I open my eyes, allow my morning habit to take me about my morning, actually tune into what that habit is. Some of you might be listening and you're like, what do you mean I don't have a morning habit? I guarantee you, if you observe yourself more mornings than not this week, you'll see the same morning. You typically do the same thing the moment your eyes open, and it might not be a structured thing, but it looks the same. We have habits that carry us behaviorally through our day in action, that carry us mentally in our internal world. If you drop in and begin to observe, simply just means watch the thoughts that are coloring your day. You'll notice how habitual even those are too. We all have a mind that's narrating everything that's happening to us, and we tend to tell ourselves the same habitual stories, which result then in the same habitual feelings, and then you've guessed it, the same habitual coping mechanisms, whether it's the way I deal with, right, that stress in my body, like we were talking about, my fight, flight, or flee response, or maybe for me, it's become how I just am now in a state of lived protection. We can become witness to all of that when we become conscious. So before we even then build that foundational reconnection to the body where the nervous system lives, where I can learn then how to regulate myself and my reaction so I can even give myself new opportunity for choices, we first have to build that foundation of consciousness, tune in, learn how to be present to ourselves, our habits, our behaviors, our thoughts, and our feelings throughout our day.
So when it comes to this first piece, being conscious, is this just when we're in the beginning part of the healing journey? Because I can see how over time, when we start to ingrain new habits, healthy ones, we might not need to be conscious all the time because those patterns and that subconscious, that autopilot is going to be serving us. And how if we were trying to be in the conscious all the time while we're, say, brushing our teeth and making our breakfast, that could be exhausting to try and think about all those steps that in a good way can become autopilot when they're serving us.
Jesse, I mean, the reason why we have autopilot, I love that you're even bringing this up, is to conserve our energy, conserve our brain's caloric resources. Our brain already needs the most calories of any organ in our body. So again, there's physiological benefit for coasting on autopilot. We get put our attention somewhere else. We can put our calories to work somewhere else. So again, we're wired for that familiarity, and we're also wired for conservation, right? It is helpful for us to coast on that autopilot. And to speak to your point, or to more simply answer your question, the goal is to learn how to access consciousness, because even if we do Of course, the goal is to lay down some new neural networks so that those autopilot habits do better serve us. I always bring a question to mind, which is our maturity, our evolution, right? The fact that our bodies are growing and changing over time, right? I always question whether or not we can rely on anything external, even a habit that we've internalized, that we've created at one point in time, because something I am discovering about the human lived experience, which is that it's ever changing. We are energetically morphing beings. We are actually evolving creatures. So learning, even laying down some great habits that benefit us in our 20s, we can't necessarily be sure that those great habits might benefit the evolving body that I am in my 50s, in my 60s. So I am always more for developing that relationship with our conscious self so that we can tune into that ever-changing body, so that I can discover as I enter new decades of life what my body needs. And we can do that when we're just consciously present, because I can just as easily turn my attention to my body as it's changing through time and discover what it needs more of and what it needs less of. So consciousness, in my opinion, isn't a light switch. I don't think that there is a human in time who's always conscious. Again, our brain will always allow us to coast in that autopilot because it needs to conserve calories, because it's not always a bad thing that we give ourselves that, attentional reprieve to be in that less, exhaustive state like you're describing. We will always have that instance of autopilot. Of course, if we can lay down some new habits, then we can rest more assured that when we're in that autopilot, that we're comfortable with the choices that we're making. Though, in my opinion, again, we don't ever want to rely fully on our autopilot. From the main reason is that we're changing beings, that autopilot might not continue to serve us.
That's such a good point. And a lot of the spiritual teachers, the reading I've done, people I've talked to over the years on the show, it seems like a lot of times, and this is just, we don't get into the nuances necessarily, but people talk about, say like when you're doing the dishes, feeling the warm water on your hands and feeling and being present using all 5 of your senses to the different activities that we're engaging in throughout the day. And the reason I push back like I did there, and it's just, I'm curious on your thoughts on that, because that can become, and you've already elaborated, but I just want to take it even a little bit further. It's like, how far do we take that? And then when do we just allow that autopilot to run so we can, think about other things and engage with others? It's
Yes.
a tricky continuum.
Yes. And I hear this too. I think a lot of times this question gets posed when we are kind of confusing or combining consciousness, which is that state of observation, right? Noticing when I'm having a thought, say when I'm washing the dishes and my mind starts to offer, thoughts for itself. That's a different state than hyper over analyzing type thinking. And I see these two get confused a lot, where sometimes we think consciousness is actually that action of over analyzing, where I'm over self-conscious in a sense, where I'm always scanning and thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking. That's still, in my opinion, right, a version of thinking, because I do hear a lot of people are like, well, can't you ever just be done healing? Am I always just like healing and thinking about healing? And, my statement is absolutely. Our goal is to not be stuck in cyclones of thought, whether or not it's about a good topic, right? Like healing, what I should do, over analyzing myself, being in that observational witness. Again, that's thinking though. That's different than noticing, than having that thought come while I'm washing those dishes and giving myself the opportunity to decide whether or not I want to dive down the spiral of that thought. And to speak to your point, not only will some of us just allow ourselves to do that in terms of our autopilot, sometimes it's of benefit to give ourselves that break. There's many times, I will always say, a decision we make in consciousness is, in my opinion, an empowered decision. And I apply this to my moments of when I'm choosing to tune out or to check out. I still have that tendency of that disconnection that I lived in. Now, though, I can choose. I can put on something mindless. I can just maybe sit and stare for a few minutes, and I can be aware enough of the action that I've chosen to do that, which then allows me to say, or to determine, I've done this for enough time now, or now I'm in a different cycle that's not helpful, this thought I'm having, and I can now consciously make another choice. Anytime we're aware of ourselves, really simply, we give ourselves the opportunity to modify. And there's many moments where I do choose now still to check out, to disconnect, to do something that's more mindless, knowing that I'm probably feeling in those moments stressed out, overwhelmed. And for me, that's a bit of a reprieve. It's allowing my nervous system to kind of re-regulate itself without stimulation. So to answer your question, doing that consciously now for me looks different than that's my resting state. I have no idea that I'm so overwhelmed and, that I'm checked out now. I'm online, to say it in a different way, in those moments.
As somebody who has dedicated their life to, studying the mind and helping people untangle the mind and think differently and be more positive and operate better in the world at its basic sense, I'm curious on how, and you've already touched on consciousness and how you think about that, but I'm curious, how do you differentiate the brain from the mind, from our thoughts, from consciousness? And again, this is just more of a thought experiment and just a curiosity thing. I'm curious how you differentiate and feel about those.
Yeah, it's I think it's really confusing. And I think a lot of us spend so much time in our thoughts that we are confused. We think we're conscious in our thoughts at that point. We think that that's kind of the filter through the world. We actually have never had the opportunity of being conscious. I like to describe consciousness as, for those of us who have ever or have overhead lights in a room. Consciousness is having all of those lights on so that I can then see or witness, right, when a thought happens, when my brain begins to create a story or narrate an event, and I have a thought. So when I have my spotlight of attention on, I can notice that I'm even thinking. I can see the action of that thought happening. Again, when I'm stuck in the thought, I might just be narrating, my life, telling myself the story. Someone could even be talking to me and I'm completely attentionally somewhere else entirely, right? I could be, if I'm conscious, then I hear the question being asked of me, right? If my lights are on, I have access to everything that's happening in that moment, from the thought that just popped up in my mind, right? My senses could be, sensing the environment around me. I feel the bright lights on me. I might hear someone call my name in the other room. If my spotlight is on, I have access to everything that's happening inside of me, and I have access to pay attention to, I should say, everything that's happening inside of me and everything that's happening outside of me. It's like the lights again on in the room, and then I can choose where I'm focusing my attention. And that's then where we kind of hook on, many of us, our thoughts, right? We start to then pay attention to our mental world, so much so that, like I was describing, I could be lost in a thought, thinking about, an incident this morning, or imagining what tomorrow's going to look like, or whatever it might be, and having someone else engage with me and me not being fully even able to, right, hear them in that moment. So consciousness, again, is learning how to turn the lights on so that we can choose where we're putting our attention. So I might see my thought happen, and it might not be time, or that thought might not be helpful in the moment. And then I could refocus my attention somewhere else. Maybe I do want to pay attention to someone who just called my name. And then I could turn that spotlight of attention and begin to engage with that person. Without consciousness, though, right, we become stuck in our thoughts. We become stuck. We don't have the ability to see what's happening, again, in our bodies or in our mental world.
Let's stick on this a little bit further and talk about somebody who's experiencing negative thoughts and they find themselves getting stuck in their head and say these thoughts are repetitive and they really are wasting a lot of their mental bandwidth throughout the day on that. We talked about the first step being conscious when it came to the work that we're going to do. I'm assuming that's a piece of it, being conscious of the fact that's happening. But what does that look like for somebody who's trapped in that cycle? How can they begin to unwind it and go the other way?
Yeah. So noticing, I think, is one of the most important parts, and not judging ourselves at whatever time it is that we notice. Because some of us might notice when we're already right knee deep in the spiral and we're already feeling terrible, or feeling whatever it is that we've been thinking about. Because that's the reality of what happens. The longer we sit in a thought, we think about things in a particular way, before long, we're going to feel, right, the reality of whatever that thought is that we have. So some of us might be tuned into hours into whatever the thinking is that we're having that's causing, now we feel terrible about ourselves, or we just feel badly in general, or whatever it is. So not judging ourselves in that moment, because some of us especially if we haven't practiced, being conscious to this, we are going to tune in when we've already spent minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. We might even come to notice our whole life we've spent engaging with these problematic, difficult, dysfunctional, whatever we want to call them, negative, uncomfortable thoughts. So noticing is huge. This is why I'm saying not to minimize, even if you do notice, oh my God, I've just spent 3 days feeling bad about this one thing, not to judge yourself in that moment, because that's an incredibly powerful moment that you've now noticed. Anytime we notice, and the quicker we can notice in real time. So we can't stop the thought from happening. I want to be clear about that. So many of us have, rehearsed, practiced these particular narratives for events for so long. It's the only option. The next time our perceptual system scans and sees somewhat similar of an event, it's going to assign that same meaning that's been validated, verified, that I feel now safely familiar with. Again, even if it has outcomes that are uncomfortable to me, it's the safe, familiar of, cause for events, circumstances that are happening. And this is what I've now grown comfortable with. So when I become conscious and I notice, then for so many of us, the spiral of thoughts at whatever time that happens, the gift I can give myself is we can't stop the thought. We don't want to judge ourselves that it happened. We can give ourselves the most important, empowering choice we can make for ourselves in that moment, I should say, is where we're choosing to put our attention. The thought happened. We catch ourselves. Maybe it is hour 3 into the spiral of that same thought. Now we can refocus our attention, unhook it from that thought and put it anywhere else. Pay attention to how your body is breathing in that moment. Pay attention to how that room does feel. How do the lights feel? Do you smell any aromas, any scents? Is lunch being made in the kitchen, right? Or can you go and do something that you can put maybe now is the time to do those dishes, and you do want to actually give yourself that moment to focus, because for some of us, we can find those hooks through our senses. Maybe it is washing the dishes. Maybe for me, for a very long time, it was in nature, music. Those were all moments where if I put my headphones on, if I go walk to the nearest park, it was more likely for me to be able to pay attention to the music, to my body walk into the park, to the sound of the, wind in the trees. That became a hook for my attention. So we don't want to judge ourselves. We want to celebrate that we notice these thought spirals, whatever they might be. At whatever time we notice, we want to celebrate. We don't want to judge ourselves, because that's a huge victory that we've noticed. And then we want to unhook, right, the focus of our attention from those thoughts, even if we did spend the past 3 days in them, and put it anywhere else. And then do it again and again and again for as long as that thought stays. Because again, it's not the light switch. Your thought's not going to say, oh, this is the inappropriate time. This isn't helpful. I'll leave you alone now. Absolutely not. That thought might come back, and it might come back. And you might pay a moment of attention, right, to this music you put in your ears. And then lo and behold, that thought's right back again. So it's unhooking your attention each and every time, and knowing that when you're committing to doing that, not only are you going to be spending less time in that problematic, upsetting thought, you're actually rewiring your brain. You're refiring up now that powerful space where conscious awareness lives. You're firing up that prefrontal cortex. You're actually laying down some new neural networks, right? Hebb's law, neurons that fire together, wire together. And you're doing just that in those micro moments. And I like to explain that because the next thought will come back. You'll have to refocus your attention, right? Back to your body, back to whatever is happening again and again and again. And it will feel exhausting. And one of the reasons it will feel exhausting is because you're firing your brain in this new way that over time will create a new network, making it easier and easier for you to do that. So it's not immediate. Especially for those of us who have been living with these spirals of thinking for decades of our life. It's not going to change overnight, though we create change when we notice, when we remove our attention, and when we give ourselves new choices actually in that moment.
All right, I want to zoom back now. So we went deep into that specific example, and I think that's going to be helpful for a lot of people. But let's come back to our main theme that we've been teasing with throughout the whole interview, which is that unhealthy bond with parents leading to nervous system dysregulation. And then we talked about when we want to begin to do the work on that, we're going to pick one thing. We're going to realize that it's going to be difficult, but we're going to do it anyways. And then we talked about becoming present, which again ties to what we were just talking about as well. But I want to stick on that general theme here and give people more general tools to do that general work if they had that childhood where they didn't have those deep bonds with the parents and that support in the way that they needed.
Yeah, I think so let's venture into, once we become conscious, what most of us will discover was, we'll notice, put it that way, that we didn't have that bond when we drop into our body. And we do see those indicators that I feel either generally unsafe, like I was describing earlier. My heart rate's always kind of elevated. My muscles are always feeling a bit tense. My breath is always a bit quick. Or we see it in moments, right? Oh, it's always this type of interaction or this relationship or, this topic that shifts me into that state. More, like we shared earlier, like I acknowledged earlier, more often than not, we will see evidence of that nervous system dysregulation as we become conscious to how our body is doing. And because, again, our nervous system, when we're not feeling safe, when we're in that emotional brain, fired up in the moment, when all of my clients would forget, right, the new tool that they want to or need to use in the moment, again, it's not because there's something shamefully wrong with them. It's because their nervous system isn't allowing them. They are locked and loaded in that habitual way to keep themselves safe because their body feels unsafe in that moment. And I keep reiterating the word safe, safe, safe here because in that space, when we're reconnecting with our body, when we discover it doesn't feel safe, either generally all the time or in these particular circumstances or instances, then we want to, this is why it's so important. And I've evolved the way I work to even call myself the holistic psychologist now. Now we want to involve our body. We do need to create safety. We do need to learn how to regulate our nervous system so that then we can show up differently. Because back to that childhood, the reason why we all adapted the way we did and I became that overachieving performer was because I didn't feel safe in my body. So now, right, if we want to have this and apply this conversation to be reconnecting with and being our authentic self, safety in our body is going to be incredibly important. When we're in survival mode, like my parents were, like I had been for so long, things like words I said earlier, interest, creativity, imagination, purpose, passion, they are not priority. Survival is our priority. So there's a reason why, if many of you were listening, like I said, those were concepts in a book. I didn't relate to living the experience of having a purpose, a passion, of interest, even though I kept myself, right, marching along, checking all of those boxes. It's because for me, my body was so unsafe. It wasn't prioritizing creativity and passion and purposes. It was prioritizing living into that next moment. So when we drop back in and we create a conscious relationship with our body, more of us than won't will discover that our bodies don't feel safe enough to allow us to be who we are, to feel safe enough to express our emotions. Maybe we didn't have that modeled in childhood, how to safely show what we're thinking, how we're feeling, and who we are. We can't just be in our own presence, let alone in someone else's. Why? Because that wasn't safe in childhood. So to be able to be our authentic self, right? That final onion layer that I'm imagining people who pick up that workbook are going to want to dive in to that third section to meet the authentic self. I intentionally, again, put that at the end because until we become conscious, until we drop into a body and discover whether or not it's safe enough to even allow us to begin to explore those deeper aspects of ourself, we won't be able to do that. So for many of us, that means then tending to our body, making sure that we're eating, that we're sleeping, that we're moving it, that we're resting it, that we're breathing calmly and peacefully from deep in our belly so that we can even then have the opportunity to explore or get curious about things like my interest, my purpose, my passion, and who I really am. To be who I am, I have to feel safe, and I have to feel safe in my body, and then I have to feel safe in my relationships.
So safety is a big piece of this, and you named a whole bunch of things there, taking care of the body. Is that what it comes down to then? Taking care of the body as a physical vessel through nutrition, through breath work, through all these self-care modalities to let the body start to feel safe as its general baseline.
I believe that is foundational. If our body isn't going to send those signals of safety, our mind and our body, and this is again something that coming from my traditional program, we're never taught about the communication from our body to our mind. Everything was highlighted And again, the mind is very powerful from the top down, though the reality of it is our body is always in communication with that mind. And if our body is constantly telling our mind that we're unsafe, it's no wonder so many of us are having those racing thoughts of anxiety and are showing up in all of these habitual ways, attempting, right, to create safety, because all the while our body is indicating how unsafe we are. So safety is foundational. Our emotions, again, bringing this conversation full circle. We spent a bit of time talking about our emotions and our emotional world. All of those as well live in our bodies. They map onto sensations, shifts, changes. And if we're not connected to our body and safe in our body, we're not going to be able to identify how we're feeling and to be able to use how we're feeling to guide us through life. So the body is not only foundational for our journey, safety in the body is foundational to have a clear mind, to be able to, again, plan for a future that's different and not to continue to find ourselves reliant on those old habitual patterns that, as we've seen over time, don't serve us.
Okay, so coming back to the practical, we're going to take good care of the body. We're going to build that foundation, which is going to provide safety. Where can we go next with the healing journey?
Once we drop into our body, then we do want to begin to explore, bear witness to those mental narratives, the stories. Like I shared earlier, we're going to continue. Our mind will always try to make sense of the world around us. The more stable and calm and peaceful and safe our body is, the more then we will have access, right, to the present moment, to assigning a new meaning. However, most of us have age-old repetitive narratives created again in childhood from stories, from events, from experiences where we weren't developmentally mature enough to understand the whole picture. So when we become witness to ourselves or conscious, once we dive in, reconnect with our body, determine how safe or unsafe it is, and begin to do the small daily promises we can keep for ourselves to create safety in our body, then we begin to witness our mind. And what we will notice is those repetitive stories result in those repetitive feelings and those repetitive emotional coping habits. So we can begin to explore all of those age-old stories, the ways that we're narrating our event that might not apply to our current circumstances. We can get clear on our inner child, that wounded space in our mind that tends to make sense of instances the same way every time, allowing us only one response in particular. For me, I'll give a lived example of this. In that early childhood, not having an emotionally attuned parent, I've developed a deep-rooted belief that I am not worthy of being or having my needs considered. In absence of having that consistent person to show up for me, to help tend to my emotions, because I didn't have that vantage point. Like you're saying, let's pull things back. Let's look at the whole story here. When we're emotionally and developmentally immature, I couldn't share like I shared with listeners. Oh, my parents are in their own survival mode. It's not that they don't love me or don't care to consider my needs. They actually can't. They're stuck in their own, right, cyclone of stressful thoughts, prioritizing things outside of my emotional needs, even a bit raised in that tradition of parenting where they weren't necessarily taught, right, that children had these needs. So now it was of no fault of my own. It wasn't that I was unworthy at that time, though, without that vantage point from that developmental immaturity that all of us have from birth until at least age 7. We will make sense of it as some reason based on me. So for me, not being considered became the narrative I applied to all of those moments where I was feeling like my needs weren't being met. I wasn't feeling cared and considered for. All roads led back to, well, of course you're not, because that person isn't actually caring for you, without any awareness that, of course, it might not be mapping onto the reality of what's happening, but that's the only way my developmentally immature mind knew how to make sense of those moments. So it continues without my conscious awareness to apply that meaning. So what that looks like in real time is me becoming conscious, seeing that, oh, maybe I texted my partner and they responded in a way that I, didn't like, or maybe they didn't respond at all. And I can then see in my mind's eye, in absence of response, or as I'm reading their response, me narrating, oh, they're not considering me, or some version of that. I can now, from my conscious awareness in that moment, I've now lived many experiences where more often than not, I'm not correct in those moments. There is something deeper that's happening for me. It's my feeling, and I can question in that moment if it's true. And in all of the instances where it's not true, again, that voice was active, like we were talking about earlier. That thought came. It attempted to color that experience. If I allowed myself in that cyclone, I might be very upset because I'm not feeling considered. I might do what I often do when I don't feel considered, which is one of two things. I either become passive aggressive and let you know in an underhanded way that I don't like how you're not considering me, or I distance myself entirely. I punish you by removing my presence. So now you try to respond to my text and I'm just a little not available for you in this moment. Instead of living all of that now, this is just an example I want to give, I'm conscious, I'm aware. And again, all of this has come for me personally, having observed myself enough, having seen this narration of events always lead me to feel this way and then react in that way, and having had the opportunity to question, knowing that the people that I'm choosing in my life now do consider me, are able to support and love me, not in the way that my mom once did or was unable to, in other ways. So in that moment, my thought didn't stop. I'm able to be conscious. That thought was there. It is a possibility that they don't consider me. And if I continue to entertain that possibility, I've lived a lifetime of knowing where that goes. And now that's that space that I was describing. Now, consciously, I can do a couple different things. I can spend less time thinking that possibility, and then I don't feel or react that way later. Or if there is something real and I have a need, maybe I do need attention. Maybe there is something active for me in that space. If someone else is not available for whatever reason to show up for me in that moment, I can consider me. I don't have to allow my need to go unmet because someone else isn't available, as I had done for so long, secretively getting resentful at them not being available. I can in that space say, you know what, Nicole, there is something that you're lacking. You're tired. You need emotional support. Can you do something now else for yourself? Acknowledging that maybe there was a very real active need in that moment. Though I don't have to just rely on that old story and that lack. I can be expansive. I can make new choices. I can use new tools to get those needs met. I don't have to rely, again, on those early things that I once did.
We talked about the body, we got into the mind. Once people start to take care of those areas and start to gain control, where can they go from there?
So as you're probably discovering, right, once we regulate our body and we get safe and we begin to unpack, peel back these narratives so that we can remain connected to who we are, then we can get curious and begin to, in that space, ask ourselves, explore what we want, what we think, what we need, what interests us, right? Those deeper questions. When we feel safe and we don't have to prioritize, or our body doesn't have to prioritize its survival, we now have the space, the freedom, the time, the energy, the resources, right? All of the calories even that we were just talking about had been expended doing all of these other things. We now have those available to begin to tune inward, to create. For a lot of us, that means even just pauses in our day to begin to factor ourselves in instead of just habitually responding or reacting or showing up, in service of this relationship, just hitting pause. And that looks like, for me, before I pick up a phone call, before I even say yes, right, to a propositioned event or whatever it may or may not be, I drop into me. I ask myself, how much energy do you have, Nicole, right now? How are you doing emotionally, right? Do you feel calm and grounded, or are you feeling tired, exhausted, agitated, stressed out? And maybe you don't have the bandwidth to be present to someone else, or maybe you don't want to do what it is that they're offering or suggesting you do right now. We can drop in and begin to ask ourselves. And for me, that's been the major number one shift on my journey. Again, bringing this full circle, acknowledging that my purpose, my passion, my interest, my curiosity, my creativity might continue to evolve and change, as all of my being may change, evolve as I grow, as I age, as life and circumstances change around me. Though if I always maintain that space, that commitment to checking in with myself, to carving out the time, the pause to ask me what I want or what I need, then I can retain that commitment to continuing to explore that deeper stuff. What lights me up? What do I find fun? What do I find interesting? On the other side of things, what doesn't light me up? What don't I like? What do I want to avoid? Which isn't something that doesn't really align with me. And then using, right, that drop in point, like we were talking about earlier, I'm not going to look outside of myself. I'm going to, throughout life, drop in with me. What does my body need in that moment? What do my emotions need in that moment? What do I want for my future?
All right, Nicole, I think that's a great place to end. Really enjoyed round 2. The workbook is incredible. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people. I know our conversation is going to be impactful for a lot of people as well. And we're going to link up the book. We're going to link up both books. We're going to link up social media, your website, everything in the show notes. I want to thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Jesse. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it.
Stick around here and catch my previous chat with Nicole. She's got a whole lot more to teach you when it comes to mastering your mind. I'll see you over there.
There might be habits and patterns that aren't serving you in your life. They are no reflection of who you are. The brain, the body, everyone's ability to change